Support for WUWM podcast comes from Life Navigators, your disability partner, offering disability services for over 75 years. More on their family resources at lifenavigators.org or their helpline, 414-774-6255.
Piping plover season is officially underway here in Wisconsin. This year marks 10 years since the shorebirds started nesting in Green Bay after being gone for decades. The Great Lakes population of piping plovers is federally endangered and at risk of habitat loss, predation, disease, and climate change. Tom Presby is the Wisconsin Conservation Manager for Audubon Great Lakes, and Jade Arneson is a fish and wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They say the Cat Island restoration chain in Green Bay is an important nesting site for the Great Lakes population of piping plovers. Conservationists are monitoring the birds there and working to restore their habitat. To learn more about the ongoing recovery efforts, Lake Effects expert Nunez spoke with Presby and Arneson for this month's Chirp Chat.
We're here at Cat Island Chain Restoration Site in the Green Bay area to talk about piping plover recovery efforts. But before we dive in, for listeners who aren't familiar with piping plovers, can you describe what kind of bird piping plovers are and what they look like?
Piping plovers are shorebirds that are a little bit smaller than a killdeer. People might be familiar with killdeer because those are birds that often nest in gravel parking lots and sometimes do their broken wing displays. Well, piping plovers are a close relative of them. They're both in the plover family. However, piping plovers are a lot rarer. They're about the size of your fist. Unlike killdeer, which will nest in a lot of different spots, piping plovers need undisturbed beaches on the Great Lakes to nest.
You know, the Great Lakes coast is part of their breeding grounds, but where do they travel from?
Yeah, so piping plovers, like a lot of birds, their life cycle is not bound by political boundaries, state lines, country lines, anything like that. These birds that nest in the Great Lakes mostly winter on the Gulf Coast and the southern Atlantic from about South Carolina through Georgia and Florida, and some of our birds even over as far west as Texas. But there are a few plovers in the Great Lakes that actually winter on Cuba and in the Bahamas as well.
And since you mentioned that they enjoy habitat that is sandy and near the coast, what do they eat?
Piping plovers, you might not think of them as a ambush predator like your favorite carnivore, but when you watch them, that's what they're doing, is they're ambushing prey. They stand there, they look around, they have good vision, and when they see an insect such as a beetle or any other kind of insect, they run after it quickly, catch it, and then do the same thing over and over again. So that run, stop style of feeding, that's exactly what they're doing. They eat all invertebrates. Sometimes they're picking through the water line, and sometimes they're hunting in drier beach and dune-like habitats that aren't even that close to the actual shore.
Yeah, they're like the least suspecting carnivore, to be honest.
Yeah.
And, you know, piping plovers are an endangered species. I was wondering if you could tell me more about that. How have piping plover population numbers changed over the years?
So piping plovers were listed as federally endangered in 1986. And at that time, there's estimated to have been 17 pairs of piping plovers across the Great Lakes region. And they all were just within the state of Michigan. So 17 pairs only at the time of listing. And their population has slowly been trending upward in a positive direction, which has been fantastic to see. For a couple of decades, they hovered around an average of 70 pairs. But then in 2023, we had a record-breaking pair count of 80. So the first record-breaking pair count of 80 since listing under the ESA. We all were very, very excited. And since that 2023 record-breaking pair count, we've again slowly been growing each year. Last year in 2025, we had 88 nesting pairs across the Great Lakes region.
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think only 17 breeding pairs at one point just in Michigan, none in Wisconsin. How are we doing in Wisconsin today with piping plover populations?
So last year in 2025, Wisconsin came in second for having the highest productivity across the Great Lakes region. So we're really proud of that. We had 11 pairs of Great Lakes piping plovers in the state of Wisconsin last year, 4 here at the Cat Island Restoration Chain where we are today, and then 7 at the Apostle Islands up in Ashland County, Wisconsin.
What are the different threats that have led to the decline of piping plovers and the threats they continue to face today?
So initially, leading up to the time of listing in the 80s, it really was development of our Great Lakes shorelines and, of course, also recreation along our Great Lakes coast. Today, those threats have kind of started to also transition into increasing predator populations, specifically mesopredators, mammalian predators like coyotes have become really a big one, but also avian predators. Merlins, they're one of our smaller falcons, have really started to become regionally abundant and have started to present a growing challenge for conservation of Great Lakes piping plovers. And then also lake levels. So right now, northeast Wisconsin has been dealing with some record rainfall for the month of April, some localized flooding. So we're starting to see our lake levels come up as a result, but we're coming off of some low lake level years, which have really benefited piping plovers. But that, of course, cycles with years where there's been higher lake levels that have, lessened the amount of shoreline habitat that's available for nesting, for example.
Thank you so much for setting up all this context for our listeners, this background on piping plovers. We talked about it a little bit, but I'm wondering where Wisconsin fits into helping piping plover populations come back up.
So Wisconsin's story very generally has historically had a stronghold and a foot within Ashland County at the Apostle Islands complex. So they are foundation of Wisconsin's piping plover population. I am not recalling a date at the top of my head for where that story started, but they did have roughly a couple decade long gap where there were no piping plovers nesting within the Apostle Islands complex, but then those populations started to come back and flourish again. And then the Cat Island Restoration Chain story sort of came online, if you will, in 2016, and I'll let Tom speak to that really amazing story.
Yeah, so before I tell the plover story, just a little bit of background on Cat Island. So this is all material that has been dredged out of the main channel of Green Bay, so freighters and other ships can get through, and the bottom of the bay is deep enough for them to do so. That first and second year when they put dredge material here, it happened to be basically pristine white beach sand, and it was obvious that we had just created a nice Great Lakes beach out here, and it's undisturbed because this U.S. Army Corps of Engineers facility where they're doing active dredging for the next 30 years or so. But the goal of the project was not only to have a place to put dredge material for the next several decades, but to provide wildlife habitat both directly and indirectly by breaking up wave energy to protect wetlands down to the southwest corner of the bay, like in the Duck Creek area. So the first year that there was new sand out here that had been dredged in, a pair of piping plovers was found. This is in 2015, but they showed up pretty late in the summer, so we knew they probably were not going to nest. But in 2016, lo and behold, a pair came back in May, and we were really excited because we thought we might have the habitat out here. And sure enough, it was May 24th, 2016, when I was watching a female and noticed, actually from a picture I had taken and zooming in on my camera screen, that she had an egg under her. And that was the first confirmed nesting of piping plovers anywhere on the Green Bay. So from here up to Escanaba in 75 years. And birds have tried before occasionally, but ended up failing either to their nest being washed out or other unknown reasons, but this was the first successful nesting because that pair ended up fledging 3 chicks that year, and that was also the first record of nesting in Brown County. So maybe it happened way back before we had bird watchers out monitoring, but to our knowledge, that's the first time that plovers have nested in this part of the bay. So adding a second consistent spot, Jade mentioned that the Apostles is kind of the foundation of their population in Wisconsin, but now that we've had successful nesting here at Cat Island for the last 10 years, it's been extremely important to their Great Lakes population as a whole to add another consistent population in Wisconsin.
Well, first I just want to know, that's an incredible discovery. I mean, what was your reaction, like zooming in on the photo, and do you remember like how you felt in that moment?
Yeah, I remember pure jubilation. We'd been thinking that it was possible since the habitat was here, and even rare birds like piping plovers are extremely resilient and they're extremely good at finding new habitat, because especially shorebirds, their whole life history is to capitalize on ephemeral or temporary habitat. So those birds saw this habitat and utilized it. And yeah, I remember making several phone calls right away to Fish and Wildlife Service, to my advisor at UW Green Bay. And it was a very, very exciting moment to know that those birds were going to attempt a nest here, and then over the course of that year to monitor them with Fish and Wildlife Service, with Wisconsin DNR, with UW Green Bay, and having 3 chicks from that first nesting attempt make it to fledgling status.
That's so exciting. I'm just thinking about how the Cat Island chain is just like such a key player in this story too. Could you talk about what is Cat Island, or like the history of Cat Island, and then what eventually made it a good habitat for not just piping plovers, but like all different types of wildlife?
So the Cat Island restoration is actually the rebuilding of an old island chain that used to be here. If you look at old aerial maps, this island chain protected the wetlands in the corner of the bay, but in the early 1970s, due to a kind of perfect storm situation where we had some very intense storms at the same time as ice out, those islands basically all got scoured away. So this project rebuilds those islands with dredge material in the old footprint of those islands, allowing water to pass through in between the islands to keep a flow going, but also to directly benefit wildlife while we're finding a place to put dredge material. And for other wildlife, Cat Island is already proven in 10 years to be one of the most important spots on the whole Great Lakes for migratory shorebirds. We've seen more than 35 different kinds of migratory shorebirds here. To put that in perspective, usually in Wisconsin, there's about 30 species that are seen annually. So we see all of those plus some rare ones. And a lot of those are birds that migrate from the southern tip of the southern hemisphere all the way up to the tundra and back in 1 year. Birds like the American golden plover, the Hudsonian godwit, and the Hudsonian whimbrel. And there's a federally threatened species, the red knot, which we see multiple times out here, usually in late May, and then again in August and early September. So Cat Island has proven to be an extremely important stopover spot for a lot of these rare and declining migratory shorebird species. And you also have nesting for state endangered species like Caspian terns and common terns. Forster's terns have nested out here in previous years. And even in the winter, this is one of the hotbeds for snowy owls, for short-eared owls, for snow buntings, for Lapland longspurs. So every time of year, Cat Island is very important for a specific group of birds, and usually multiple groups of birds.
And something I want to go back to, a lot of our listeners might not be familiar with what a piping plover nest looks like. So could you describe what that looks like and where they're usually located around?
Piping plover nests can be very hard to find. We typically find them more by behavior than what the actual nest looks like. You can usually tell that a pair, especially the female, is acting different than normal, whether she's kind of skulking around, or the real telltale sign is when she's laying in the same spot for a half hour, multiple hours, because she's probably got an egg or more under her that she's starting to incubate. So all the nest really is a scrape in the sand, or more typically in the gravel or cobble that's mixed in with the sand. And they lay usually 4 eggs, sometimes 3. But this time of year, when they first return, that's one of their most common mating rituals. Is the male will actually go around the territory making multiple scrapes while the female watches him, and then eventually the female will pick one of those scrapes that develops into their nest. It's kind of like, the male is taking her out house shopping or something like that.
Yeah, just which one's good enough for me?
Right.
Well, can you tell me about if there are any other critical nesting sites in Wisconsin or similar efforts being done in the state?
So in addition to the Cat Island restoration chain, another really critical breeding area is the Apostle Islands complex up in Ashland County. Within that complex, there's an island called Shuquamigan Point. It's also known as Long Island. That really is the hub for piping plover breeding. Last year in 2025, they had a record 7 pairs. Unlike Cat Island, this is a very long linear shoreline, naturally occurring, and has a really expansive dune system with some really beautiful marram grass. So that's kind of like the quintessential breeding habitat for Great Lakes piping plover is Shuquamigan Point. And then we also have Wisconsin Point in Superior, Wisconsin. They do not at present have a breeding population there, but there has been an extensive effort by partners, particularly Wisconsin DNR and St. Louis River Alliance, to bring in beneficial dredge material and build out suitable Great Lakes piping plover habitat, or just shorebird habitat more generally. They've been doing a lot of invasive species and other just general vegetation maintenance out there to continue to maintain the site as suitable, and have spoken with individuals like myself or folks at other breeding sites to kind of see what elements they can bring in there to make the site more suitable for Great Lakes piping plovers. So we have our fingers crossed that, someday as we really kind of start to build our population numbers elsewhere, like at Cat Island, that birds will start to radiate out and hopefully use Wisconsin Point as well. And then more recently and excitingly, just north of the Cat Island restoration chain, we have Longtail Point, which is just behind us. It's most likely what Cat Island used to look like before we had lost it to the storm events that Tom described. So it's a sandspit depositional feature off the bay's western shore. It has some cottonwood copses, some willow outcroppings, some really nice wet sedge meadow, then also these really small open sand inclusions that we've started to see Great Lakes piping plover use. That was beginning in 2023. And what Tom and I and others have been learning is that the birds that have nested out on Longtail Point since 2023 have really begun their nesting story at the Cat Island chain. So we usually see them here and either attempt to nest and fail and then go northwards to Longtail Point and re-nest. Or we see them come here and, try to stake out a territory, but maybe are unsuccessful just due to the number of birds and the amount of competition here, and then they'll move north to Longtail Point and begin a nest there. So that's been exciting to see that start to develop out, and just kind of goes to show in part that where there's suitable habitat, these birds are finding it. We're also learning that there's likely a carrying capacity here at the Cat Island restoration chain. We usually average around 4 pairs. So as we start to see that number grow, birds are radiating out and using other habitat.
So now that we've established how piping plovers and the Cat Island go hand in hand, what do recovery efforts for piping plovers look like today?
So regionally, our recovery efforts are pretty broad and involve a really large partnership of folks. So just a huge thank you to those people. It wouldn't be possible without them. But we are undertaking a variety of targeted recovery actions. Monitoring is a really huge one that I'll let Tom speak to because he's helped develop that out here at the Cat Island chain. We also conduct banding. So last year, I believe it was around 98% of our breeding adults have unique color bands, which is huge because then we can tell who these birds are on an individual level and start to kind of build out their individual stories. So we get to learn about how old they are. We can track what their productivity has been across the years. Another really targeted recovery action is our captive rearing program, which really is amazing. A lot of folks, I don't think, know about that program. It is headed up by Detroit Zoo in addition to a cohort of zoos that come together every breeding season to help support those of us in the field that find plover nests that have either been abandoned or a member of the pair has, disappeared or possibly died. Another scenario, which Tom and I have experienced here at Cat Island, is what we call like extra pair copulations or extra nests. So instances where usually it's the male already has a pair established and a nest established, but then will seek out additional females and initiate additional nests. And where that gets to be challenging is that both members of a pair are really important for incubation. They trade off throughout the day. So if you have one member of a pair that's trying their best to incubate more than one nest, or maybe can't incubate more than one nest, that's where we can come in then, thanks to this captive rearing program, and salvage eggs, put them in an incubator, and then bring them to these facilities across the region. There's one in Pellston, Michigan. That's our local center, where they then have this really amazing team that incubate these eggs for us and ensure that they're successful all the way up until they fledge. And then we, as a team, get to come together and talk about where we're going to release those individuals. So that's been a really incredible tool. In 2023, we had a record number of captive reared individuals, so we leveraged that, and they were released at sites that we wanted to bolster the population at, or newer sites that we wanted to establish a population at. So every nest that we find in the Great Lakes region, it's standard protocol to protect those nests with what we call exclosures. They are a 5-sided structure that's built out of wire mesh, and that wire mesh is kind of just big enough to allow adult plovers to enter and exit so that they continue to get to their nest. And it's beneficial in that it precludes a lot of our avian and mammalian predators and allows us to have greater nest success. So that's really been pivotal for the recovery of this species.
There's so much that goes into help them be successful in breeding. You mentioned that there's a huge effort with monitors. What do monitors do? Like, what does a shift as a monitor look like?
Yeah, so Audubon Great Lakes and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coordinate monitoring at Cat Island and places throughout the Great Lakes every year. At Cat Island, we're helped tremendously by habitat management that the DNR does, student monitors at UW Green Bay, volunteers through Northeastern Wisconsin Bird Alliance, and other volunteers in the area. So it really, really takes a big team. We've got more than 30 people on our team monitoring, and we're out here every day, no matter what the weather, between about early April and late July to early August, depending on when our last birds leave for their fall migration. That includes holidays, it includes weekends, and usually somebody's out here for about a couple hours on average. And keeping track of what birds they're seeing and also how those birds are behaving. So we have a few different stages during the field season. Right now in April is when birds are returning and starting to pair up and defend territories with other birds. And then in May is really the nesting time when we find those birds on their scrape nests and, as Jade mentioned, put exclosures over them. And usually the first chicks are going to hatch in early June. So once those chicks hatch, the responsibilities of monitors grow because thanks to the exclosures, birds are relatively safe in nests. But those chicks and the parents can go anywhere, and chicks are obviously very vulnerable. They're adorable little ping pong ball sized fluff balls, which is really, really cute. But at the same time, even though they can run surprisingly fast, even a bird like a herring gull or a crow could easily snatch one of them up and swallow them whole, sadly enough. So monitors go out every day to make sure all of the chicks that are known to be out here are still here, how they're behaving. So throughout June, we have the chicks, and that goes into early July. These chicks grow quickly. They're capable of flight in about 3 weeks, a little bit more than that. And that's when we consider them fledged, which means that they're a lot more able to get away from a predator, able to basically fend for themselves. Then they start migrating pretty early, even though it's fall migration. The females will actually leave as early as the end of June, and then the male usually takes the chicks the rest of the way to becoming independent. The males will leave about a couple weeks after the females usually, and then the juveniles leave last, usually in July or even early August. So it's fascinating that these young birds don't even follow their parents down to the wintering grounds. They just have it wired on instinct somehow where they're supposed to go, and then often how to come back to the exact same spot the following year. So monitoring really does have a lot of things that people are looking for every day. Another really, really big one is predators. We had an instance a few years ago where a common grackle ate eggs out of a nest. So monitors giving us information on predators that are lurking near known nests, sometimes even intervening when a predator is actively going after a plover, all is really, really important. And then occasionally we'll have unfortunate scenarios like diseases where one year botulism got into the population. It hasn't happened yet, fingers crossed, but avian influenza is something that's really on our mind these days. So it's really fun to come out here and monitor, but there is a lot of responsibility on these monitors' plates every day.
So this work that's being done in Green Bay is just one part of a major recovery project across the Great Lakes. What's the long-term goal of this recovery project in general?
Yeah, fantastic question. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has a recovery plan for the species that was published, I believe, in 2002. But really the big goal is to see at least 150 breeding pairs across the Great Lakes region. Last year we had that record 88, so we have a ways to go yet. At least 50 of those 150 pairs we would like to see established outside of the state of Michigan. So Michigan really continues to be the stronghold for the population. So of course, in order to see that population grow and be healthy and stable, we would like to see them be successful breeders outside of the state of Michigan. Again, we had 11 in the state of Wisconsin last year, just to provide some perspective. Another piece to the recovery goal gets at the productivity component. So seeing at least an average productivity of 1.5 fledglings for every breeding pair. We usually see, 4 eggs laid in a nest cup. We also hope to see habitat continue to be protected and restored and enhanced. That's really a big piece of recovering this species too, as well as education and outreach.
Well, we're getting close to the end of Chirp Chat, but I want to ask, what can people do to take care of piping plovers and support these ongoing recovery efforts?
Cat Island is really important for birds because of the habitat that's here and also because it's protected. There's some birds that we're all very familiar with that disturbance isn't really a big deal, but for birds like shorebirds, not being disturbed while they're trying to fuel up on their migrations is extremely important, which is why it's so important for when you see piping plovers or other shorebirds on publicly accessible beaches to share the shore by respecting them with a good distance, keeping dogs on leashes, picking up any garbage that you see, being stewards of that beach that we're lucky enough to share with these species. So finding those birds, respecting their space, reporting those birds to Fish and Wildlife or Audubon or to eBird, so we know what areas they're using, especially if they might be nesting, so those areas can be protected, are all really important ways that people can help piping plovers and other shorebirds. Another really important thing, I talked about being an advocate. A lot of this monitoring, well, almost all of this monitoring and keeping track of these birds is thanks to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. This is funding that comes through Congress. It's usually supported in a bipartisan way, but talking to your legislatures, supporting this action, telling them how important you think not only the birds of the Great Lakes, but the health of the Great Lakes is, and why Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and other funding for habitat is so important, really, really, really is a big way to help these birds.
Well, Jade and Tom, we've reached the end of Chirp Chat, but before we wrap up, I always love to ask guests to shine a spotlight on a bird for the month. So I was wondering if there is a bird or a specific piping plover that you like to highlight for this month.
Yeah, so we'll talk about piping plovers, and they're fascinating birds. Our king of Cat Island, quote unquote, here, Obi, who's back for his 9th year now. He actually hatched somewhere else, so he's 10 years old. We know that he has been responsible for 26 chicks that have fledged over the last 8 years. Very, very impressive and productive numbers. And the female that he typically breeds with, Violet, is the female who's back right now. She is in her 8th year at the site, and she's been responsible for fledging 23 birds over those years. So we know all of that because of banding. And it's really, really cool to be able to tell the stories of these birds, shine a light on how unique and how good they are at overcoming all of the obstacles that they face, not only during the breeding season or wintering season, but also on their migrations. So Obi is my nominee for the bird of the month.
Where do I think people will wonder, because I've been wondering, where do these names come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do name our birds, and I know that sometimes personification of wildlife can make people feel certain ways, but it's an easier way to communicate who these birds are than giving their banding combo all the time, which is something like XY colon lowercase b uppercase b. It's just a lot easier to say something like Obi. So in Obi's case, it's because of his banding combination. So the O part of it stands for orange, the B part stands for light blue. So this bird has multiple orange bands and multiple light blue bands. However, sometimes we give birds names that don't come back to their banding combination. We had a female here for several years that we named Miss Packer because she had the very locally appropriate green and yellow bands on her. We've named a bird Vince after Vince Lombardi before. So we find as many fun ways as we can to name the birds.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing Obi's story and sharing this incredible story of the Cat Island chain restoration site and the piping plover recovering effort. This is just really incredible work that's being done in Wisconsin, and I'm excited for more people to learn about it.
Thank you so much for having us and for coming up here.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting us and allowing us to share the story of these amazing birds. Appreciate it.
Tom Presby is the Wisconsin Conservation Manager with Audubon Great Lakes, and Jade Arneson is a fish and wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They both spoke with Lake Effect's Grit Nunez at the Cat Island Chain Restoration Site in Green Bay, Wisconsin. You can learn more about piping plover recovery efforts and listen to other Chirp Chat interviews at WUWM.com.